This afternoon we're very fortunate to have Jim Wood, who joins us from the Getty Trust and all of the various aspects that he'll share with us this afternoon that he has himself learned about freshly in the last many months. He joined in February of 2007 as the Chief Executive Officer and President and Chief Executive Officer of the Getty. And Jim, many of you would know from his years of service as the director of the Art Institute of Chicago, as president of the Art Institute of Chicago and director, from 1980 to 2004. And all of us gained from that over many years of acquisitions, exhibitions, expansions, and contributions of all kinds. He had begun a Midwestern life before that as director of the St. Louis Museum of Art, and had been a key person in thinking through how the collections would grow, both there in Chicago, obviously, and leavened by an experience in Buffalo at the Albright Knox, and an institution of great consequence as well in collecting and in fostering the experience of a community. And like me, he started at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and we are refugees from other experiences as well. He sits on the boards of the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute, the Institute of Fine Arts in New York City, which is part of New York University, and the Pulitzer Foundation for the Arts. And Jim, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Great pleasure.
It's been a Herculean day for him. He flew in from Chicago. He had a few minutes of rest, and then we spent 2.5 hours in the galleries. He hasn't been here for a while, so welcome back.
The best way to judge the vitality of a city is to get into their art museum, and this is a vital place.
Well, but the airport wasn't shabby, too.
The airport was remarkable, I must say. No, I had not realized that you had finished this, what, a week ago? I was pleased that you did this for me, Max.
It was, well, we like to impress our out-of-town guests, and you know, we want to start there and then get you into the galleries. But you got to Los Angeles as an out-of-town, not a guest, but a resident. And as an Easterner, a Rhode Island boy, that in some ways was a big change for you, and you knew it well from afar. But what's it been like to make the transition?
I mean, home originally was Boston, a long way from Rhode Island. But actually, I mean, as Max said, I came to New York for graduate school at NYU, and then first job at the Met, in a tiny little position, but in this glorious, huge institution. And I've been really moving west ever since, Buffalo, St. Louis, Chicago, now LA. And LA is totally different. I mean, if you think about the Albright Knox Gallery in Buffalo, if you think about the St. Louis Art Museum, and then the Art Institute of Chicago, they are all the product of world's fairs and expositions at the end of the 19th century. And a city at the end of the 19th century that could do that and then have a permanent museum grow out of it tells you a lot about the history of their civic commitment. And LA is just the opposite. I mean, LA is this extraordinary, energetic place. I'm loving it. But my template of Chicago, everything from the grid, the lake, but much more importantly, this cluster of great civic institutions in a public park, available from public transportation, supported by not only a remarkable tradition of donors, but citizens who, you'd run into people on the street, and once they realized you were the director of the Art Institute, they'd say, "Don't mess up my museum." LA, very, very different. Of course, the Getty, totally different. The result of one man's generosity. So in effect, we started with an individual and now are trying to be a catalyst for encouraging, stimulating, you know, a broader sort of civic commitment in LA.
So at the Art Institute, you had a very different remit and obligation around a civic institution, and you were the one show in town. That was it. You have a little competition at LACMA. You have other sorts of arenas, and they're not competition per se, but there's a more diffuse cultural universe in LA than in Chicago.
True. I mean, Chicago had the Museum of Contemporary Art, a vital, good institution, which was to some degree, I mean, so many of these earlier cities, there was this pattern where you had, because the Art Institute, of course, began buying Monets when the paint was wet. They were buying contemporary art. They showed the Armory show in the museum, which wasn't shown in New York. There was a tradition of the contemporary as part of this expanding general universal museum. At a certain point, almost always these institutions, another institution springs up because the big institution is no longer contemporary enough. And it's a good thing, it's a healthy thing. The Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago was playing that role. In LA, it's really a different, LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum, has always had a very vital contemporary component. But again, MoCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art there, grew up from a group who didn't feel LACMA was cutting edge enough, wasn't focusing enough on it. I think the biggest difference in LA is these name museums. I mean, the Norton Simon, the Hammer Museum, the Getty Museum, all the results of wealthy individuals who collected, who danced to some degree with the big Universal Museum, the General Museum, LACMA, and then pulled back and created their own thing. And it's created a remarkable cluster of institutions, which, given LA's horizontal, spread out growth, has great advantages, but it's also deprived the city of that kind of cultural focus that these earlier cities we've mentioned
So
had.
Miami is a similar world where these amazing private collections have so far danced around the Miami Art Museum. What's the future in Miami, would you guess?
That's a good question. Miami really doesn't have any institution with the ambition, I think, of that sort of general universal collection. And the emphasis is very much on contemporary or recent past, as I see it. I mean, it seems to me over time, I mean, two things will happen. It'll fragment into a number of, sort of private collections, little Kunsthalles, most of which will fail, or maybe a group will come together at some point and say, 1 + 1 can be 3, and we're going to have a particular focus. And that focus, I would assume, would be some really vital connection with Latin America. But
I have a naughty anecdote about Miami, which is a major collector of 20th century material offered a suite of Rauschenberg prints to a museum there, and it was said to him by a member of their collecting committee, "I'm sorry, we don't collect reproductions." So,
there was always the sophistication problem.
So tell us, you've got what some consider a mega museum, and you describe as a series of divisions and institutions. Just give us a sketch of who reports to you in terms of expertise around
at the Getty.
At the Getty.
Well, the first crucial fact, and I have to keep reminding myself of this, is I'm not the director of the museum. I'm the president.
I'm sure your director is grateful of that.
No, it's the reason that when I was offered the job, which surprised me tremendously, I took it, because it was a totally different challenge. I mean, no one leaves the directorship of the Art Institute of Chicago and becomes the director of another museum, as far as I'm concerned. It would be a step down, Met included. I mean, the wonderful thing about the Getty and my position as president of the trust, I'm on top of really 4 programs, and we've just gone through a strategic plan and sat down with the board, top staff, and just challenged every one of our assumptions. And the first one was, well, do we have the right number of legs on the stool? And we concluded, yes. There is a museum, which is the largest piece, a good museum with 2 remarkable, sites, collecting in very specific areas. Then there is the Research Institute, which is one of the major, it's quite miraculous. I mean, in a 30-year period, they put together one of the great art history libraries in the world, over 1 million volumes and substantial special collections. And they bring in scholars, and it's a very active international research institution. Then there's the Conservation Institute, and their role really is to further the practice of conservation. So we are as involved in finding solutions, be they technical or managerial, literally in terms of how you manage sites, and working with people around the world to try to solve problems and then make those problems replicable. And the 4th leg of the stool is a foundation, the Getty Foundation, which gives us the ability to make grants within the specific area of the visual arts to further the mission of these other three parts of the institution. Then there's accounting and a legal. The missing piece, or let's say the absent piece in the areas that report to me is there's no membership and there's no development, which tells you something about the unique nature of this institution. I mean, it is totally dependent on, but also, at least so far, as of 2 weeks ago, able to function on its endowment. This is quite a new challenge for me and probably most people in our profession. A tremendous advantage, but also, I must say, a tremendous responsibility, because every penny we spend came from one gift, and if we can't justify the way we spend it, and there are a lot of people ready to tell us we didn't do the right thing, we would be justly criticized.
Mm-hmm. Well, part of the pressure then is also what seems to be a fairly new change, which is about Southern California being an obligation of yours versus the world. We're going to fix the world's problems. And over the last several years, the Getty has come to a kind of binary focus, if that's fair to say.
I think that this was always, the early documents, and after all, Getty died in 1976. So the institution, literally from 1976 until 2007, when they completed the expansion and sort of redesign to some degree of the villa and the surrounding structures at the Getty Villa. It's an institution that has been in physical change. They've been building, expanding, redefining themselves, trying different programmatic areas. I really have to call it a prolonged adolescence, in the best sense. But as you remember, adolescence isn't the time when you often value your siblings. You're often trying to kill them. We have now, and I really feel this isn't my doing, a great deal of it is the chronology of the institution, just the completion of a whole first stage of, physically solving the institution. We are now entering young adulthood. That means, and a fundamental part of our strategic plan was, everything we do has to maximize the collaboration between our own parts. And second, we have to be absolutely sure we are good citizens in Los Angeles, but also that we're making use of, collaborating with these extraordinary institutions in our Southern California region, of which there are a tremendous number. And this is as much selfish on our part to make the most of what's around us as a sense of obligation that we need to be a primary, catalyst for improving the cultural life there. This is wonderfully challenging, I must say, because LA is an incredibly diverse, dynamic place.
So you have a mayor who's a vital, lively man who has clearly made culture part of the way he talks about the city. And what is it like to work with Mayor Villaraigosa?
Antonio is quite extraordinary. He is a ball of fire. He is not particularly knowledgeable in the arts, but he is how to describe him properly? I would say, he is determined, for the best of reasons, to really speak for this incredibly diverse community. He has a tremendous disadvantage, and the first meeting I had with him, which was shortly after I came, just to say hello and sort of present my credentials. We don't get money from the mayor or the county, but he said, "You've spent a lot of time in Chicago. Boy, do I envy the power Rich Daley has." and of course, what he meant was that he's the mayor of the city, but there are also the administration of the county. And as in almost everything in Los Angeles, it's a system that seems to have been designed to fragment itself rather than to unify itself. So, I think we have a good working relationship. It's very different from institutions where you are dependent on funding from a political source.
Yeah, that's not a problem we have here. So, moving up a notch to the gubernatorial slot, I introduced you to Arnold at the entrance, the
Yes.
sculpture by Orly Genger.
I noted it
which
was the
is-
biggest piece.
It is the biggest piece. It's the Überlebensgroße image of the bodybuilders of Mr. Universe that Orly Genger cites around the Ephraimson entrance pavilion. So tell us about Arnold. What's that like?
I mean, I really haven't had that much. He actually lives in Los Angeles. The Getty, just by the nature of its visibility, its extraordinary sight, is a very appropriate place for politicians to do things. And of course, we are careful to be sure that it doesn't make us partisan, but these aren't political rallies, but anything to do with the arts, you know, where these political leaders are encouraging, trying to build support for the arts or education, we are more than happy to be the venue. Mm-hmm. And that's really the context in which, I think in terms of the arts, his wife, who happens to be of a different political persuasion, is going to be a real asset. Mm-hmm. And I'm not talking about the Getty now in terms of support for us, but it is support for the arts. And we all know, even if you don't get a penny, the attitude and example set by top political leaders can have a tremendous effect on how people view the arts. Are we intellectual and elite, or is this something that's vital and assumed to be an absolutely basic part of everyday life?
And from your fresh Illinois roots, any Obama administration contacts yet, or is that something which is coming in? What do you expect to happen differently under the new administration?
I mean, not contacts in my own case. I think this is going to be extremely interesting, and I'm very positive. And let's leave the party, regardless of what party. Yes, it's a change of party, but it's really a change of personality and a totally different individual. We have to remember that his first date with Michelle Obama, he took her to the Art Institute. This is true. I mean, this is a man who, first of all, there are going to be no apologies for intellect. I think we are going to see in his desire, the way he builds his administration, an attempt to be both elite and populist. And that is not an oxymoron, in my opinion. I mean, Philippe de Montebello has done that at the Met, I think, brilliantly. I also think that there is going to be a whole shift in the way we relate to the broader world, where soft power, cultural diplomacy, a term that we hear actually coming from England, our colleagues there, is going to be more and more important. And another question, it seems to me, Max, and I'd like to ask you this one. Bill Ivey, who was the past head of the NEA, apparently is managing a transition team on the arts and culture. One has heard just indirectly that some people are floating the idea of a cabinet position for culture. Having chewed on that a bit myself, my feeling is this would be a great mistake. I don't think what this country needs is a cultural position for the arts. I think we need an administration that absolutely supports them, both psychologically, gives more money to our national endowments without strings attached, and maybe most importantly of all, absolutely defends the tax deduction and the inheritance tax.
Well, you spoke about elite and populists, and surely the Getty is the epitome of elite and populist, because you've got 2+ million visitors a year, but you espouse the very highest standards in conservation and research and publication. So how do you go about taking apart, say, the GRI or the GCI and balancing the elite and the populist?
I mean, part of this is a communication problem. I mean, most of our visitors, most people who think of the Getty, think of it as a museum with these two extraordinary campuses. They really aren't aware of the Research Institute, the Conservation Institute. Ironically, the further you get away from the physical site of the Getty in Los Angeles, the more people are aware of the Research Institute, the Conservation Institute, because they have had over a 30-year period now a tremendous impact really globally, you know, within the narrow area of the visual arts. But the Scholars Program every year brings over, you know, approximately 40 scholars from around the world. They spend, you know, a substantial amount of time there, and then they go back to where they've come from. I had a wonderful trip with our new head of the Research Institute recently to Germany. It was the kind of way you travel, probably. Berlin, Cologne, Dresden, Munich in 10 days. It was fantastic. Just meeting our colleagues, focusing on the museums, what they were doing, what they were going through in terms of reinstallations, everything from acquisition and installation to financial questions. In each one of those cities, the top people, 3 out of the 4 of them had been Getty scholars, and they'd been Getty scholars before they really had risen to the top position they were now in, and I just found that very, very gratifying and a tremendous encouragement and responsibility that we continue to look for people at that middle level with potential and try to add something, to their development.
Speaking of responsibility, you were the first museum in the country to declare a moratorium on acquiring antiquities unprovenanced after 1970 and have since taken other very progressive steps. So fill us in about how that's working and how that's affecting the program of the museum and other aspects.
I mean, this occurred before I came. It was negotiated by Michael Bren, who's the director of the museum, did a very good job. Max has been very involved in these issues. The result, first of all, I think the Getty did the right thing. We all know that the hardest call is where are there compelling legal grounds that something should go back and where aren't there. My experience actually in this field was more in Chicago, where we had 2 or 3 of the earliest Holocaust challenges, in terms of things in the collection. And it was very painful because there was a charge made, which we hadn't expected, and then you were instantly tried in the press. And it was the institution against the Holocaust survivor. And that was not the way you wanted to frame an issue. What we learned, and the profession learned, was you just had to step back and then really, absolutely openly determine what the facts were. We gave things back. We negotiated some settlements. I'm proud of what the Art Institute did, but also the profession. I think the whole question of the Holocaust issues has acted correctly, and now, if there aren't, I don't think there are going to be that many more claims, but if they come up, there's a whole context they can be dealt with. That is calm, not emotional, not on the front page. The antiquities question is much more complicated, tied up with resurgent nationalism, tied up with... and I think the Getty's decision was absolutely right to agree on this year, 1970, which most of the museum profession has now accepted. It drastically curtails your ability to buy, which in many ways is a shame, but I think it's the price we need to pay, should pay at this moment. The other side of it is we've negotiated relationships with the Italians and the Greeks, which were fair. Everything they claimed did not go back, but we went case by case, and at the end of the day, the things that went back, there was a compelling reason, and we got agreement from the other side that, all right, this is a good faith effort, and here's where we're going to draw the line legally. That has opened up the possibility of exchanges and loans, and I think it's something that's just beginning, though. I mean, there is Asia, there is Africa. What we're looking at is a century of collecting under very different ethical and even legal contexts. And it's very dangerous to apply today's ethics, less so today's law, although you have to be very careful with that too, to earlier situations. So we're going to have to go through each one of these areas and parse, hopefully, the right answer. I mean, I am very much in favor of, believe passionately in the importance of the world's art being in other places than where it was created. At the same time, you can't break the law. How retroactively you apply the law, we're going to be talking about that for a long time.
Well, you spoke about self-imposed limits in collecting, and the Getty very conspicuously doesn't collect in certain areas of art history.
Right.
So how's that feeling to you, old art history buff that you are?
Well, my comment about directing a museum and the artist. And I had the incredible good fortune to be the director of a wonderful museum with a universal ambition, not a realized ambition the way the Metropolitan has. That's really ours and maybe the world's most comprehensive encyclopedia. The Getty is a wonderfully arbitrary place. Its collecting grew out of Getty's interests. French 18th century furniture, of which we have one of the greatest collections in the world, is basically complete. I mean, it's hard to imagine needing to add anything. European paintings up to 1900, where we could spend the rest of our lives and all our money slowly building, and you'd never get where you wanted to be, but we're making progress. European drawings up to 1900, very small collection, but looking to try to buy just major things where it'll have real importance. European painting and sculpture up to 1900, sculpture and, well, it includes the decorative arts, so there's one department, again up to 1900. And then photography, which begins with the invention of the medium and comes up to the present. And of course, Mediterranean antiquities, Greek, Roman, and Etruscan. As part of our strategic plan, we looked at these areas of collecting and asked ourselves, well, should we stop collecting in any one of these areas? Should we enter a new area? Our conclusion was no. Each one of them, to varying degrees, we will be more or less active in. As I said, French decorative arts, it's an extraordinary, literally complete collection. Photography, which brings us up to the present, and there's a wonderful serendipity, I think. Well, not serendipity, this was really planned by John Walsh, the earlier the director who created the photography collection, because Mr. Getty, I'm sure, would be appalled to feel we're spending his money on photography. But the Getty has been able to build one of the great historical photography collections, and it brings us into the 20th century and right up to contemporary art in a city which is, its whole life was about manufacturing images and the communication of things through images. So I think it's absolutely appropriate for the Getty. Now, this leaves you with an institution that is very atypical. I think that's fine. I think that is actually part of its appeal, and I'm much more concerned with our going deep in these areas than trying to spread more broadly.
Well, we were talking about Tim Hawkinson earlier, who had a great exhibition in L.A. that Whitney helped birth, and of course, Bob Irwin's gardens are essential to the Getty. So you do have connections with artists of our time, Martin Puryear and others.
Right.
So how do you balance that to the existing mandate that is photography focused in the contemporary
world? Well, first let me say, Bob Irwin, one of the real pleasures about living in L.A. is just the incredible artistic ferment there and artists, and Bob's become a great friend. And you've got a fantastic piece here you commissioned from him. It is wonderful. And just animates that space. I mean, I think this is a real coup. We aren't going to collect much past 1900 anywhere except photography, maybe video. The Research Institute has actually a large collection of video as an art form. So this area of the photographic and later types of the moving image, yes. The living artist beyond that, our challenge, I think, is to tap the vitality and the excitement of the living artist as a way into the history of art, but not be collecting. Now, we'll do that. Irwin, of course, was commissioned to do the garden. So it's an accessioned object in the museum's collection. And this garden is an extraordinary, perpetually contemporary experience. I don't see us doing that again. There isn't a place for it, for no other reason. I do see us, as with Hawkinson, and it's really this is the decision of the museum, not mine, but selectively, very carefully, looking for contemporary artists who can come in and realize an intervention or a site-specific installation for a period of time that does two things. It could only happen at the Getty, or at least it takes tremendous advantage of the particular site we have, and an artist whose work hopefully will, perhaps in a very problematic, unexpected way, make you think about going back in time. In other words, as an entrance, an artist of your own time, who you can then go from that back into the history of art. I think it's always better to go reverse chronology. I find it hard to come to a museum and start with Egypt.
Since the stock market began behaving so oddly a few weeks ago, everyone's facing a lot of tough choices. So how are you and the board of the trust walking up to those challenges in your case?
Well, the first thing I'm doing is not calling my chief financial officer on a regular basis. I mean, we, like everybody else, we're an institution that is, 99% dependent on the flow from its endowment. We average the value of the endowment over 3 years and take 5%. So we are insulated to a degree, as most institutions with endowments are, from immediate short changes. But we are absolutely working out scenarios of sort of good, bad, and really ugly to be sure that we are making decisions in terms of this year, where we have a substantial increase with what it may be 2-3 years out. I think we have to wait and see quite a bit. It's going to be setting priorities. I mean, we are not insulated from the loss of market value. I hope we are invested as intelligently and as diversely, and we have, you have advantages with size, but that doesn't make us immune. I don't want to be overly pessimistic either, though. I mean, this is going to be a hard time for the arts, not just in the United States, but everywhere. But it also may be a time where we become a little more aware of history, where we realize the need of the arts in hard times, which are always, I think, greater than in those decadent periods in between. So we'll see.
Let me ask you a question which is a bit of a provocation in relation to what you just said about the Getty's focus, art before 1900, largely European, and then we watch Asia rising, perhaps stumbling a bit as the rest of us are right now, but looking at India and China. How do museums that have a primary focus on matters European cope with, deal with, find energy from, or in some way offset the fact that European life is declining, American life is declining as a percentage of the world's creativity, activity, vitality?
And this is a really important problem for us, or opportunity for us, I would say. As I said, we're not going to change our collecting patterns, but, and already, I mean, in a way, the Getty has been a global institution from its inception. In the research area, in the conservation area, I mean, we do projects around the world. One of the, one of the earliest projects that was begun was in Western China, in Dunhuang, which is one of the jumping-off points for the Silk Route, an incredible complex of caves, hundreds of caves with some of the greatest, it's the key, one of the key monuments in the history of Buddhist cave painting. Getty's been involved in determining ways to conserve these for 20 years now. We've worked with the Chinese to create something called the China Principles, which are not only expertise in terms of restoration, but then once you've restored a site like this, how do you manage the increased tourism and desire to see it? Because the great danger is you restore something, the restoration creates new interest, the new interest destroys the site. And so there are areas, and this isn't the only place that's happening. We've just signed an agreement with the Egyptian government to restore Tutankhamun's tomb, which has very sophisticated, complicated wall painting problems. We've been in Egypt for a long time. We had done restoration in the Valley of the Queens a decade ago. Again, the project is going to be restoration, but perhaps more importantly, developing with them a whole site management program to how, in this case, it's not just the flow of tourists, but also the flow of water when you get these flash floods, which can destroy the work, of 10 years in, 20 minutes, if you haven't engineered the site in a way that prevents water from coming back into these tombs. I mean, that is one area, and it would be nice if we could make it better known to people that this is part of the Getty's mandate and what we're doing. But in a way, I think if you do good things, eventually people will realize it. Now, on the other side, we're not going to change our collecting patterns, but we are absolutely convinced that it's essential that in the mix of exhibitions we do at our sites in Los Angeles and the programming we do, we absolutely not only look west to Asia, but south to Latin America. And in the next several years, the museum already has 2 exhibitions planned. One will be Aztec sculpture drawn from the National Museum, the Archaeological Museum in Mexico City, and this will be shown in the villa. And another exhibition that will be shown in the villa will be Cambodian bronzes from Phnom Penh. In both cases, the idea is to bring other archaeological traditions and bring them into this remarkable site in a faux Roman villa devoted to the arts, the archaeological arts of the Mediterranean. And it's really, continuing on what was Marion True's, the founding curator's, or one of the most important curators' vision, which would be the villa and the Getty will be a center for comparative archaeology. It won't just be the areas we collect, but through loan and conservation work and collaboration, we bring in these other cultures and show them in the context of what we have in the permanent collection. And I think this is absolutely the way of the future and very important for us.
You mentioned the Danwang Caves. Of course, a big part of that proposition has been the photographic documentation historically and forward. And that touches on your remarkable commitment to technology. And I was wondering if you could share with us some of the things that are happening with new media at the Getty.
Now, as you all, Max is the master in this, and I'm enough older than he is that I'm a bit of a Luddite compared to your mastery of this. One of the most important areas for technology with the Getty has been the technology needed for advanced conservation. If you visit the Getty, the campus you experience at ground level. The institution is drilled down into that mountaintop 3 floors down, and there are really extraordinary and very extensive laboratories and scientific facilities, which is very high tech. The use of digital means and the web and all to communicate information, again, as we went through our strategic plan, the museum is well documented. I think we have a good website. Most of the collection is really quite available. There's more we can do. The real challenge for us, an opportunity, is the GRI, the Getty Research Institute. And we set our priorities there that the collection, we have special collections as well as this vast library. Those special collections are unique. Many of them are fragile. So the first priority in terms of digitizing is going to be these special collections. Down the line, it'll be interesting whether over time we find ourselves buying fewer books because these are shared digitally with more institutions, and put more of our effort into continuing to build the special collections, which are artists' archives, unique things. In one sense, we're trying to collect rare individual things. The more of those we get, the more responsibility we have to digitize and make them available through the web.
You've been drilling a lot in recent years beyond down into the mountain. You've been drilling into the world of transparency and opening up the Getty to public scrutiny, partly in response to challenges that you faced in leadership before you got there. Tell us about what it's like today. Things have calmed down about the transparency issue, but what kind of commitment should we all have in this field to that kind of openness about our books and how we work and how we hire people and how we spend money and all the other ingredients?
It is better not to have the Attorney General in the back room. The Getty made mistakes, there were indiscretions. It was absolutely correct that they went through what they did. And frankly, the board that hired me had tackled that problem, had instituted, had made fundamental changes, and had instituted, enlightened governance. I think the real challenge going ahead is not that complicated. That word transparency is thrown around a lot, but my feeling is almost anything that goes on in the institution, you better be ready to see it on the front page of the paper. Secrets are something of the past. And not because we necessarily want to be utterly open in all of our transactions. You'd like to have the price you pay for this or sensitive negotiations, kept confidential, and we'll be able to do that to a degree, but we're entering a world now where you have to assume that almost anything Okay. And I think the biggest challenge there is not fighting that. The biggest challenge is not editing yourself so that all you do is talk, things that you don't think there's a chance you'd ever be embarrassed by. Transparency cannot be at the price of risk-taking. So every now and then we're all going to get nailed for something. Hopefully not illegal, but something where we were taking a risk and maybe someone else there decides it was the wrong risk, or it's a risk that doesn't pan out. It's not going to be a risk about, can we get away with buying this work of art with no provenance? But it may be a risk of investing in something that turns out to, not give us the return, and I'm talking a cultural return, not a monetary return now, that we hoped.
I want to give a chance if there are some questions from our audience, and before that, one last question about the headquarters of the Getty now and Brentwood. It's been over a decade there, and surely in part of your strategic planning, you're grappling with the issue. You've been so successful, so busy with visitors and acquiring, and what has to happen next to the top of the hill?
Well, this move from adolescence to young adulthood, we will keep growing, but I hope it's going to be intellectually, the quality of the collections, the research. Certainly, one of my mantras right now is not another square foot. We don't want to expand our footprint. One of the challenges of money is people just assume you can and should do almost everything. And a lot of people's at least twice a week, there is a request that we would take over X landmark, that would be the perfect place to house this, it would save it. Our response to that is we are putting considerable funds into the first serious landmark survey that LA's ever had. We're putting, as of now, after a 5-year build-up, $5.5 million into a series of exhibitions that's going to be called Pacific Standard Time, working with 15 fellow visual arts institutions in Southern California, where we've paid for the research for them to go back into their archives, find out what they've got about the arts in LA from post-war, 45 to 1980, and then there'll be a series of exhibitions. And it's turned out that there is tremendous material that's coming up. And now this whole group of institutions will be doing, in 1911, a series of exhibitions on their different sites. Now, I'm convinced it's going to make a contribution to understanding a very vital period in American art, world art that was in Los Angeles. But also, given what's happening in the economy and all, it is turning out that this is coming at a very good time, because it allows us to, for a broad, thought-out part of our mission, put meaningful money into the creation of exhibitions that are, developed by these different institutions at a time when it's going to be harder and harder to get money for special exhibitions, and particularly special exhibitions which I think can be very popular because they're dealing with our own culture in Southern California, but aren't the ones that you'd have much chance of getting outside sponsorship for.
That sounds like rich territory. So,
we are not a political entity. By law, we really can't lobby in any political way. Obviously, stressing the importance of these works of art. It wouldn't be the Getty taking a position against the Taliban. I don't think that would be particularly productive anyways. It's much more the importance of what is out there. If there is a position to be taken, to be blunt, it is helping persuade our government that if you go to war, one of the things you plot, among everything else, is where are the great artistic sites, the museums, the great libraries, and be damn sure you're taking care of them as well as the Ministry of Oil. That was the horrendous embarrassment in what we found ourselves not doing in Baghdad. We have been very involved, following that and active now with World Monuments in developing what do you call it, a sort of global tracking or locating system, which is actually based in Jordan, because it's a more stable country at this moment, but locating all the sites in Iraq, which will be of great help in just knowing what's there, and through satellite photography, being able to help them, and as soon as we and other countries, if this will happen, I hope it will, can get more people on the ground trying to restore and just protect those sites. So this is a delicate, part of it is documentation. The more we can help document the world's monuments anywhere, God forbid if they're damaged, or then at least you've got a crucial piece of information to go back and try to restore them. Actively, politically trying to counter fundamentalism, tough. To get really philosophic, I think by promoting the idea of the arts, the universal validity and the need of the arts, which is by definition anti-fundamentalist, any kind of fundamentalism is essential and positive.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Let me give you an example. This is how our different sort of legs of the stool can collaborate with each other and enhance what we do as a total. We've been involved in Tunisia for quite a while, developing ways of restoring and maintaining mosaics. And of course, the Mediterranean, all around the Mediterranean, there's tremendous tradition of Roman mosaics, one of the great art forms of antiquity, and often in many ways the hardest to sort of preserve. And the Conservation Institute has been for years there developing techniques for restoration. It's funny, I asked one of the experts there and I said, well, what's one of the most important things we do? And he said, grout. And when you think about it, developing the right grout for the right situation is a real high-tech challenge. As we helped uncover, restore many of these mosaics, the role for the researchers is enhanced tremendously. Things are made visible, they're photographs, we learn a great deal about them. The Getty Research Institute has researchers and also archaeologists and art historians. So we're one of the few places under one roof where you have what at moments can be warring different professions, all committed to at least a single goal. Then the third step is, and this happened in the Tunisian situation, in many cases, some of these were lifted up so they could be preserved on a solid backing. At that point, it became possible for us to borrow a drop-dead exhibition of Roman mosaics from Tunisia, which we borrowed, helped restore, then sent them back, obviously, to their, where they would be there. And finally, the foundation was able, in a couple of cases, to provide a grant that would make parts of this happen. It's not as though in every case all four arms of the Getty can work that well together, but this was a wonderful example where we really enhanced the different parts of the institution. People, when you come up to the Getty, people use different words for it. Some call it an acropolis. One person called it Masada. That was tough. That was back, I think, when we were still getting our act together. The analogy I like is an Italian hill town with a piazza and civic buildings around that piazza which constantly meet in the piazza, and really the ideas, as in the earlier Roman Forum, are worked out collaboratively in the piazza. The problem with the Acropolis analogy is that's a place with temples to different gods, often competing. So,
like it used to be.
To get back to our desire is, let's say, Spoleto, and not the Acropolis.
Yes.
Yeah. That's a good question. I really appreciate your observing that and remembering it. But particularly if you're directing a museum, particularly a large, complex museum, it's amazing. the only person who sees the dust ball is the director. I don't never understand it, but plus, the great danger in a museum is to use that luxury of being in the galleries alone, which has its own excitement. But then you never see the public interacting with what you're doing. And there's nothing like, walking behind the two nuns and hear what the hell they're saying. And what's the give and take. In the Getty, I'm not the director, so there's a less direct, let's say, responsibility. At the same time, I mean, the situation at the Getty is, whenever possible, to walk around the whole place. The galleries, but walk down into those laboratories, see what's happening, what are the research projects going on in the GRI. Partly because it's a great pleasure and a luxury, but also it's really the only way you get a feeling of what is going on, and for people to get some idea that you're interested in what they're doing. It's amazing how many people in a complex institution don't think you really care what they're doing. And if you convey that, even if you may feel otherwise, it's not good.
Yeah, your next trip here has to be on a weekday so you can see our conservation laboratories and all the work of everyone working in the museum. Time for a couple more questions. Yeah.
Good, but it should be better. I've just hired a new head of the Research Institute, which would be probably the most obvious connection, a man named Thomas Jenkins. Thomas is a German, but in addition to teaching in addition to teaching in Berlin and being really a central figure in the whole European art history world, he concluded that Germany had two wonderful art history research institutes in Italy, their former fascist ally, and he said, in France, we have none. And he created, literally from whole cloth, the German Institute for Art History in Paris. Not huge, but an incredibly dynamic, wonderful institution. Thomas had gotten that to the point where the German government said, all right, this is such a success, we will now take it over and pay for it. And I was very fortunate because he then accepted to come to the Getty. So I've got somebody now as the head of the Research Institute who is absolutely committed to doing research, but also, collaborating with the other academic institutions in the area. One of the first things he did was, made appointments with, people in the leading universities in our area. Part of this is, we're up in the hill. I think the responsibility is for us to reach out. We're doing that. I think we're going to have more collaborative projects now. At the same time, we don't want to be restricted just to the LA institutions. Because in many cases, there may be an area the Getty is working on where the most dynamic faculty member or whatnot, be at the, maybe the University of Wisconsin. So it's balancing the local, where you've got the students, of course, who can actually come up and participate more directly, and our academic involvements elsewhere in the country and abroad.
I want to thank members of the IMA staff who came in on a Sunday. I think they felt it was a command performance, and I'm certainly grateful to you. And everyone who came today to benefit from Jim Wood's presence in town. Jim, we're so grateful to you for coming and making the trek, and hope you'll come back again and see more of what we're up to.
Well, I plan to. Look, Max has given me an intense 3 hours in the museum, and it is a marvelous place. You have got one wall, far more than one, but there's certainly one wall that may be the greatest wall in any art museum in America, which has your Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cézanne, three of the most moving, powerful, talk about synergy or interconnected. Those three works talk to each other in a way that it's extraordinary.
It's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much, Jim, for coming. Thank you.